everybody. Welcome to another episode of Everyday Strong with Dr. Michael G. Daniels. This is your host, C.B. Baker. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or day, whatever time you're listening, looking at this podcast. Today, Dr. Daniels, I wanted to cover, because you gave me the task of reading the Bible, and I wanted to cover some of the things, the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Daniels.
Yeah, well, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Like you say, good evening, good morning, good night, whichever the case may be if you're listening to it. It's always great to be here. Wasn't sure we were going to make it today because of the snow that we encountered yesterday, but fortunately the sun has come out and the snow is melting, and it's a good day.
Yeah. So, and my kids was definitely shocked at the fact that they had to get up and go to school this morning because last night it wasn't looking like they was going anywhere.
Yeah, looking pretty rough last night.
Yeah. So, Pastor, you have said on the pulpit and you was preaching many Sundays ago about how Jesus took care of all the sacrifices. And as I'm reading through the Bible, and I am in the Leviticus, and God is laying down all the laws with Moses and Aaron, and there's a lot of sacrifices in there. So I was wondering, it's like, okay, do I need to read this? Because I don't have to do it anymore if I believe in Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Or is it good to go ahead and read through it and understand some of the things that's in there?
Well, yeah, and you're right. Leviticus, for those who may not have read it, Leviticus is the book of law. And basically the reason why it's called, Leviticus, the Levites, it was the laws that were given to the Levites and the priests for them to carry out as far as their worship and those kinds of things. When you look at the book of Leviticus, you're right. It can be difficult reading. And because we are not bound by the law, oftentimes, people are uncomfortable. Well, should I really go through all this stuff? After all, I'm not going to be sacrificing any animals. Right. The reason why I think it's good to study Leviticus is because if you want to understand someone's personality, if you want to understand how they think, if you want to understand, how they operate in general, it's good to know what platform they operate from. For example, if I want to know how you parent, how you are as a parent, I can look at how you discipline your children. And how you discipline your children will tell me a lot about your character. I can look at the rules you set up in your house to tell me a lot about how you are as a person and a parent. For example, if your children at 7 years old, let's say, have a curfew of 12 o'clock midnight, then that tells me about you as a parent. Right. If your children are not required to clean up after themselves, or those kind of things, it gives me an idea of how you are and your character. So to me, studying Leviticus helps me understand God. And when you look at the book of Leviticus, it's really broken down into sacrifices or offerings or worship based on a couple of things. One is just to acknowledge that God is the grand creator. It's just to say, well, you know what, Lord, you are who you are. And because of who you are, you deserve my worship, right? Right. Then there's a set of laws that deal with trespasses against God, right? Let's say if I've sinned against God, then there's the idea of, well, Lord, I need to recognize that I have wronged you. So therefore, I, need to get it right with you. Then there was trespasses against, your fellow man to say, right. Well, okay, what if I have wronged you as an individual? Well, do I need to make it right somehow? Right. Because we have to have order, we have to have discipline. So you had those laws. And then there was just offerings of thankfulness. Lord, you blessed me. You've given me all this. You've given me a great harvest. You've given me a great family life, good health. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you for that. So that's how those laws were basically set up. Now, when you think about that, you're right. Jesus came and he gave his life so that a part of those laws we didn't have to cover anymore. For example, if I sin against God, well, I don't have to sacrifice animals anymore because Jesus paid that ultimate sacrifice, okay? But what about if I sin against you as an individual? Right. Well, true that Jesus paid the price so that God won't hold me accountable for that sacrifice against you, or that sin against you.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I haven't wronged you.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that I should not do something to make the wrong right. And so Jesus said that, think not that I come to destroy the law, but I came to fulfill the law. And his point was being that the law, if you examine the law as it looks at how do I deal with wrongdoings against a brother or a sister, the law is designed to give us an outline of love. So if you do these things, it shows love, because it's hard for me to just say love you, but then don't tell you what love looks like. If that,
right.
If that kind of makes sense to you.
Yeah. There was one part where Aaron's sons was doing sacrificing, offering to the Lord, and they didn't do it right. And the Lord killed them. It was kind of shocking because everything was going in, and all of a sudden, boom, so this is not right, and he killed them. And what was amazing was it was recorded Aaron's response, which was, you could tell he wanted to say something, but he said he kept his peace. What I got out of that was, it made Aaron human to me. Like, he was upset, but he's like, I'm upset, but I know better than to say something, because I don't want to end up like my sons.
Right.
So it also showed that God meant, he was serious about what he meant that he put in there for how you're supposed to do the offering and the sacrifice.
Well, and he still is. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't appreciate the seriousness of how God is in the relationship we have with God. And you're right. You raised a point that I find interesting. As a pastor, it's kind of humorous the way you just described it, because you said it made Aaron human. Right. I get what you're saying.
Right.
Because when people read the Bible, they forget that these are ordinary people.
Right.
These are human beings with feelings, with fears, with anxieties, and it wasn't like everything they appreciated. Just like today. We don't appreciate everything that God has asked of us, and they were the same way. And I think the difference for them is that their understanding of God was a much deeper appreciation than what we have. Because they were their survival was a little different than what our survival was based on. For them, they understood the relationship between God supplying their needs and them having the ability to supply their needs, because they saw it, again, in a more firsthand kind of way. So you're right. Aaron certainly, he's a human being. Moses, all of those patriarchs are human beings. What they recognized was that their frailties God made up for with his greatness.
Right.
So when you look at our worship today, there's an unfortunate thing. The people today believe that it's okay to play with God, in their worship, in their giving, in their service, in the whole nine. And what they don't seem to understand is oftentimes a part of the problem that they deal with are because of that. Once you acknowledge that God is the center of your life, and once you begin to say, I'm going to serve and worship him, then coming to church as a social thing is not pleasing to God. It just isn't.
Right.
And that's what a lot of people do. They come to church for entertainment. And the example you gave was a great example, that God is not our entertainer.
Right.
And worship and church service is not for entertainment. And so for them to give an offering without their heart being right, and give an offering without being in the right mannerism, God found distasteful. He finds that distasteful today. When people come to church because they're simply looking for the choir to excite them.
Right.
And I will even reverse that. They came to church, they came to the temple because they understood coming to God was giving back to God. It was giving back to God. It was giving him of something. People don't come to church to give. They come to church to get.
To get. Right.
And they assume that God is pleased with that, So what happens is they come to church and they'll say things, and I've heard people say this on several occasions, either to me about other pastors or sometimes to me about my own ministry, and they'll say, Well, I didn't get anything out of church today. Well, what did you come? Were you buying something? You know, did you come to buy something? You know, you don't come to church to get. You come to church to give. And so you're coming to church. And I say give, I don't mean money per se.
Right.
I mean, you come to give worship. So if you come to give of yourself, that's why we should come, to give of ourselves, not to sit back and receive and receive and receive and receive and receive. It's unfortunate, and that's why I say it's good to read Leviticus, because then you'll begin to understand God. People that spend all their time in the New Testament really don't have a good understanding of who God is. They have a good understanding of who Paul is, one of the apostles. Because that's what they spend most of their time looking at, the Pauline epistles, and that's the focus. Because there are more epistles by Paul than anyone else in the New Testament. If you want to understand God, you need to go back to the Old Testament more. Right. Because then you can see him giving direct information to people. It's the difference between me listening in on a conversation that you have, or someone third party telling me what you said. Right. And I think that's, to me, is the huge difference. Old Testament, it's like I'm eavesdropping on the conversation. New Testament is someone told me what he told them. Right. And whenever someone does that, not saying, I'm not trying to say the New Testament is in any way, less than the Old. No way am I saying that. But all I'm saying is that if I really want to understand God, then understanding the Old Testament really just, boom, locks it down. We just view God as being welfare. I mean, that's really how we view God. Right. It was welfare. Lord, I need, Lord, I need, Lord, I need, Lord, I need. Right. We forget that God made man for his pleasure rather than the other way around. So most people, when they come to church, are not looking to please God. They're looking for God to please them. Mm-hmm. And again, Leviticus kind of makes it clear. If you don't please God, God has a way of dealing with you. Right.
And what's another thing that I find that was kind of interesting, which is indirectly, even though it was put to death, you could kind of get the sense that it wasn't final. Like, you knew that the people understood that, okay, they're dead, but they're in the spirit now. They're not, bridging back to some of the other things that we talked about in the podcast. So even though the people was put to death, it's like, God said, okay, you're not here no more. Mm-hmm. And they literally instantly, they won't even hardly even talk about it anymore. Right. I know in Leviticus, they went through like maybe 5 other laws before he got back to Aaron and his sons. Mm-hmm. That's how insignificant that was. So it puts things in perspective. Like, look, if you're having a rough day, take a step back and take a look around. Your situation and yourself is not that big to where God can't just handle it with just not even blinking.
Absolutely. And you raised 2 great points. Your situation is not that big, nor are we. Right. Right. I mean, like you say, in the grand scheme of things, it was over with, and then God moves on. Right. And so in the grand scheme of things, we place so much importance on us. Right. We act like we are the center of the universe, and that what we want and how we want it done, if it doesn't get done that way, then you know what? The sky is going to fall, you know, and the earth is going to stop turning around. And we are so focused on, if you can't do it my way, then that's you are so much against me and you hate me. That is so narcissistic, right? To think that the world revolves around one individual. But you're right. God in Leviticus, he let them know the world don't revolve around you. Right. You can be going tomorrow and we're going to move on. Right. Because, again, God made us for his pleasure, not the other way around.
Right. And there was one part in there where he talked about what you can eat, what you can't eat. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like a situation where you had to figure out what he was saying. It was cut dry and to the point. And it's just like, well, and it's funny that I read it and it was so clear as day, because I've been in debates with people, at the barbershop, Or you had to at a house party, what you can't eat. One guy said, man, ain't no swine. And other guys like, oh, you Muslim. And then he said, well, it's in the Bible. Then we're sitting there talking about this stuff. And it's like clear as day, do not eat swine. And and then the don't eat fish without any scales.
Right.
Now, once again, you preached on the New Testament where, I think it was New Testament. I think it was.
In Acts, probably, I think it was you referring to.
Right. When he said, now this is clean.
Right. Here's what Jesus said. He said to Peter, right? He said, what I have called clean, don't you call dirty. Right. But let's understand what's going on. Okay. What were the laws for again? Jesus said what? That he didn't come to abandon the law, but to fulfill the law. Jesus also said that all the law and all the prophet are there for one purpose, that we might know how to love. And that's how God loves us and how we would love each other. So were the laws just there just to be put there? No, that's the key. Just like current laws. Current laws are not here just to have them. Mm-hmm. The current laws are here because of where we are in society today.
Right.
So let's take the eating laws, for example. You can compare the eating laws, let's say, to our traffic laws. All right? Mm-hmm. Now, there used to be a law that dealt with where you could park your horse.
Right.
Right? It's not valid anymore. Right. Well, because what? We drive cars, right? And after a while, all the speed limit law is going to be different because we're not going to be driving a car anymore. And so it's going to be, not 55. It's going to be whatever, those hovercraft will go at.
Right.
Right. Well, see, those laws were for our health. There were laws not just for eating right. And if you think about it, they were the laws that were for issues. Issues meaning those things that come out of our body, those secretions that come out of our body. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the eating laws, for example. If you just, kind of like categorize them, what they were is that you don't eat anything that eats other dead things. Right. You don't eat scavengers. Right. There's a reason for that, because scavengers eat dead things, but they also eat diseased things. And so if they're eating diseased things and you eat them, you get the disease. Right. So that was the issue. And also for health reasons, because you think about this, for example, fish without scales, generally speaking, are high in cholesterol. Right. So it's health issues involved. And so that was the issue. See, they use, no, I'm not telling you to eat a lot of pork, but, people tell you pork ain't the best thing for you, right? Right. But they used the pork as, like they were wild boar. It's like you find running around in the woods, right? But they used them as garbage disposals. So all the pigs are doing the outskirts of town, and you take your trash and you throw it out there, and that's what the pigs ate, all the trash. So again, they ate all the filth, okay? Anything that was diseased, they threw it out there, the wrappings and everything, pigs ate it, right? You eat the pig, you are what you eat. You eating disease. Right. So it was the part that was health issues. The same thing, there were laws about if you have an issue. For example, there was a law that said if a woman was in that time of month when she was menstruating, right, that she was unclean. Therefore, she couldn't come to the temple. Right. She couldn't come so in our days it would be what you can't come to church. Right. Well, let's think about that for a second. That would mean more than likely that what? 1/4 of the church will be absent every Sunday. That's right. Right. As a minimum. Right. If that was the same thing. You couldn't sit in a chair behind a woman. Right. Because they say what? Now the chair is unclean. Well, because what? They didn't have sanitary napkins. They didn't have those kind of things that we have now. So those were laws that were put in place for health reasons. And so again, but you have to understand how, again, that's why I say you understand the mind of God. Why was God doing that? To protect us, because he's like a father. Just like you do things for your child, right? At a certain point, you might tell them what? You can't stay out after 7 o'clock. But when they get older, you might say, now the curfew's changed to 11 o'clock. Right. And it's the same way. And that's why, as we progress to the New Testament, in the story you're referring to is when Peter was in a trance, and Jesus says to Peter, listen, anything that I call clean, don't you call dirty. And another thing that they had as a part of their law, for example, is about, the washing of hands before you eat. And there was a time when Jesus' disciples ate without washing their hands. And so individuals were chastising them. And Jesus said, hey, wait a minute. You don't understand the law. basically. He says, it's not what goes in a man's mouth that defiles him. He said, you all are assuming they are defiled because they have dirty hands. He said, it's not what goes in a man's mouth that defiles him, but what comes out of his mouth. Because what goes in his mouth goes through his body, goes through his intestines, and drops out somewhere.
Right.
What comes out of his mouth proceeded from his heart. And so that's the stuff that defiles him when he talks dirty, not when he eats dirty. Mm-hmm. And so again, but the laws were there for health reasons, as well as, again, that's why I'm saying that look at the categories. There was some that were there that dealt with, how to deal with one another. Some dealt with health, dealt with sacrifices, the whole gamut. But that helps you understand how God operates and how, think about this. Here's a God, here is a creator that back then, way back before you had penicillin and all this kind of stuff, was still setting up health laws that are valid today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you were contagious according to the law, it is separate yourself for a period of time.
Right. It was for the lepers. It was 7 days.
Right.
On the first sign, then they would check you again.
Right. They got to keep checking.
Right.
If you had an issue, if you had open wound or something and it was infected,
right.
And you had, or if you were congested, right, and you have a runny nose, that's an issue. You had to separate yourself, right, because when you get infected. Look how many years that was ago when God set that quarantine methodology up.
Right.
Because it didn't have penicillin. Well, because God was doing things, to protect them from themselves.
Right.
And from each other. Because if I got an issue and I'm around you and I pass it on to you, now you infected.
Right.
And if I care about you and I love you, why would I want to do anything to cause you harm? And that's the basic tenet of what the law is set up for.
Now, you touched on a little bit on the people who that just only want to stay in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And years ago, I had a person. The person was like, "I don't know why this pastor's always going back in the Old Testament. You should be in the New Testament. Why are you even going touching into the Old Testament?" And I was, I didn't know. I was like, well, I mean, it makes sense. And I remember telling the person, I said, well, Jesus was Hebrew too, wasn't he? So he was following what was in the Old Testament. So I would imagine it has some merit. Then that opened up a whole nother can of worms of the debate. But what do you tell people that come to you with that, if they do at all?
And people do. And again, it's out of ignorance, obviously. Because what they're focusing on is how do we reconcile their ability to sin and be forgiven. See, that's their whole take.
Right.
Is that Jesus died, so therefore my sins are forgiven. Their interest, their motivation is not to please God. Because if your motivation is to please God, you want to know everything you know about your Creator.
Right.
If your whole motivation is to say, well, I'm saved and that's it, then you're not motivated to please God. You're motivated to please yourself. That's a selfish interest. That I'm saved, I'm going to heaven, and that's it. Your mindset is wrong. Our mindset should be to please God. And if I'm trying to please God, I got to get out of that mindset and say, I want to know all I can know about the God that I serve, because that's how I'm going to please him. Jesus quoted the Old Testament in several occasions. So if Jesus quoted the Old Testament,
right,
if it's good enough for Jesus, obviously it's good enough for me.
Right.
And not only did he quote it, but several of those writers in the New Testament, they often quoted the Old Testament, which gives a clear indication that they themselves understood the need to understand the Old as well as the New. And there's a reason why they didn't quote it as much as we think, because the people they were talking to, they knew it. Mm-hmm. It would be like, why would I have to quote to you about Martin Luther King?
Right. That's right.
I know you know that.
Right.
So I talk to you about present day. Now, every now and again, I may say, remember Martin Luther King said,
right,
we got to get to the mountaintop, but I'm not going to sit there and quote the whole,
right, the entire thing.
Right, to you, because I know you know it. And it was the same way. So the New Testament writers, they were writing to people primarily that understood that history. So therefore, they didn't have to keep on, going over it over and over again. But there were times when they did quote it, and there times when they did recognize it. For example, I think Paul mentioned in one case, Paul said, right, we should never forget the commandment of promise, which is what? honor thy mother, father, and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon this earth that the Lord thy God giveth thee. Well, he's going back to Leviticus and saying this is part of the commandments that God gave Moses on the mountain. So he didn't say that we shouldn't do it. He was just noting the reason why we should do it.
Right. It's funny you mentioned that on the Ten Commandments part, because I was expecting, I guess due to the movie, more grander
commandments.
Right. There's a whole this big thing that happened. It was literally, this is what it is. And like I kept reading, I was like, so that's it. That's all it happened. He came down. This is it. There you go.
Right.
It's amazing how simple everything is. And then also a lot of the stuff, once the Lord said, this is law and this is what I want, everything was level. Mm-hmm. So you get this, it's like it's even. Mm-hmm. It's not, okay, this is more important than this one. No, all of them are the exact same.
Right.
Same level. Don't break any of these.
Absolutely. And like you said, you look at, Charlton Heston,
right.
In the movie, and the assumption is there are only 10 laws that are in the Old Testament. But as you know, there are laws dealing with a host of things.
Right.
There are laws dealing with how you treat your, foreigners. All of those things were law. In fact, current taught law is based on the Bible.
Right.
And the more you read the Bible, the more you get, and now I see why our laws are established this way, because that's what it's based upon. But you're right. And we have a tendency to presume that one law or one commandment carries more weight than the other. Like we assume that murder is the most, heinous thing you can do in God's eyes.
Right.
Right. But you're right. When you look at Leviticus, well, he didn't say that murder was worse than lying. That ain't what he said. It's far from it.
Right. It was on the same level.
It was on the same level. In fact, he indicated, well, not in Leviticus, but if you read further on, he indicated lying as one of the things he hated the most. In fact, the Bible says, 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, they are 7. Right? And the 7th thing is a lying tongue.
Right. So
in God's eyes, he liked that least, well, I shouldn't say least, but more than he, disliked a murder. If I think that if we were to say, and people do this, but I'm not saying you should. Well, let me back up. If you listen to what Jesus said, as we compare the New Testament to the Old Testament, when Jesus was asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus said, "The greatest commandment is to love the Lord thy God with all thy mind, body, heart, and soul. And the second greatest is like unto the first." Right? He said that you love your neighbor as yourself. So if we take what Jesus said and we look at the commandments and say, well, okay, if that being the case, are any more important than others? Not, or does God weight them more than others? When I say weight, I mean as far as penalty.
Right.
Are any more important? Well, Jesus clearly said, yes, that the way that God gave them to Moses signifies how he views the importance of them in our relationship. And again, I'm just stressing the relationship, okay? Right. Because the first, the way you break the command, we just look at the 10 commandments, not the whole host of commandments. But if you look at the 10 that was placed into the Ark of the Covenant, the first grouping was based on relationship to God. That was the first grouping,
right? Which
would say that that our priority has to be relationship to God, right? Because the first one, what? Thou shalt have no other God before me. Right. So that's number one. That's what Jesus said, that's number one. Once you move away from those that deal with God, then, remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy, those kind of things, so how we worship God. Then they get into relationships with one another. That's why Jesus said the second is like to the first, because it says, he says, now love your neighbor as yourself. So he's saying there are 2 ways to look at those commandments. One deals with God, one deals with each other. And the priority should always be putting mercy with God first, because that's why I was created. I was not created to find a wife.
Right.
I was created to serve a God. Right. And finding a wife was just to keep me happy while I serve my God.
You have just heard part 1 of this episode.
Please tune in next week for part 2. Once again, this is your host, CB Baker. Next time.